I knew something in me had fractured long before I dared to name it. For the moment arrived not with violence, but with a silence so complete, it felt like a blade laid gently across my throat, a quiet invitation to acknowledge what I had tried for decades to bury beneath litany and discipline. I stood before my brothers in the chapel, censer in hand, its smoke rising in pale ribbons that curled like the ghosts of forgotten prayers. And when I opened my mouth to begin the familiar psalm, one I had recited since the earliest days of my service, no sound emerged. My lips shaped the syllables, my tongue traced the motions, my chest tightened with the pressure of unspoken devotion, but my voice remained still, lost in some hollow place beneath my ribs where faith had once burned with the certainty of a star. The novices stared in confusion, the veterans in subtle concern, and I felt the weight of their expectations settling upon my shoulders like an old mantle grown too heavy for a body no longer certain of its purpose. The moment stretched into something painful, and my breath stalled as though caught between defiance and surrender. The air tasted of incense and dust and my own shame. If you wish to understand what it truly means, stay with me until the end. When the silence finally broke, it was not by my doing. The choir began the psalm without me, their voices steady, unwavering, rising through the vaulted chamber with a devotion I could not echo. I stepped back, as though distance could disguise the betrayal unfolding within my chest, and felt the censer's chain tremble against my gauntlet. I feared they would see it, that tremor, that small confession of weakness my armor could not hide. The emperor's sigil above the altar flickered in the candlelight, its shadow stretching over me like a judgment I had earned but not yet accepted. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe, but even my breaths felt foreign, as though borrowed from lungs that no longer wished to serve the life they sustained. I remembered the first time I had sung that psalm, young and unbroken, my voice bright with conviction, and the contrast struck me with the bitter tenderness of a wound reopening. The choir's harmonies swelled, filling the chamber with a warmth I could not feel, and I wondered when the ember of faith within me had grown cold. Not extinguished, no, that would have been easier to bear, but dimmed, flickering like a candle struggling in the drafts that haunted the old chapel's stonework. Something had changed, slowly, subtly, the way a crack spreads through a statue's marble face until one day the sculptor no longer recognizes his own creation. I had not noticed the moment the fracture began, distracted by war after war, loss after loss, each burying a piece of me beneath duty's unyielding demands. The emperor protects, we said. The emperor provides, we preached. The emperor listens, we promised. Yet in the dark hours between battles, when blood stained my hands and names I could not save whispered through my dreams, I had begun to suspect that my voice reached no further than the inside of my own skull. Still, I tried. I persisted. I clung to ritual like a drowning man to driftwood, hoping fervently that structure would hold me where faith could not. And yet here, now, in the most sacred chamber of our fortress monastery, even the comfort of rote recitation had abandoned me. I felt naked within my armor, exposed before those I was meant to guide, and the weight of my skull helm at my side seemed to mock me with its unblinking certainty. My brothers looked to me for strength, for clarity, for the unwavering resolve of one who speaks in the emperor's name, and I could not even gather the breath to form a single holy line. The psalm reached its midpoint, a verse that praised the endurance of the faithful, and I felt something inside me twist painfully at the irony. My throat tightened, my vision blurred at the edges. I stepped further back until the shadows of the chapel swallowed me whole, and in that darkness a thought came unbidden, quiet as a dying ember. What if my silence is the truest prayer I have left? The notion terrified me. It soothed me. It seated itself in the hollow of my chest where sound had refused to rise. I remained there until the hymn ended, trembling not with fear of punishment but with the dawning recognition that something vital within me had slipped beyond my grasp. When the final note faded and my brothers filed out in disciplined rows, none met my gaze. Out of respect, perhaps. Out of pity, perhaps. The chapel emptied, leaving only the echo of their fading footsteps and the low crackle of votive candles. I lowered myself to one knee before the altar, not in reverence but in exhaustion, and tried once more to force the psalm from my lips. A whisper emerged, thin and ragged, dissolving before it reached the air. I bowed my head and let the silence settle over me once more, heavy and strangely tender, as if the Emperor himself had laid a hand upon my shoulder, not in blessing but in mourning. And it was in that quiet, broken moment that I understood. The psalm I forgot to sing was not merely a lapse of memory or strength. It was a confession, a crack wide enough for truth to seep through, a herald of the long unraveling that lay ahead. The morning after my voice abandoned me, I fastened the chaplain's gorget around my neck with hands that trembled in a way I hoped the dim sanctuary lamps would conceal, though denial tasted hollow even as the metal touched my skin. The collar's interior still held the faint warmth of countless litanies spoken into it, as though the prayers of my predecessors lingered in the ceramic, unwilling to leave me entirely alone. Yet I felt unworthy of that inherited heat. Each clasp clicked into place like a judgment rendered, sealing around my throat with a familiarity that had once comforted me, but now pressed upon me like an accusation whispered in a tongue too ancient for mortals to deny. I had worn this collar proudly through decades of war, its weight and anchor tying me to purpose. But today it felt altered, denser, colder, as though forged anew from the ashes of promises I had made to others and failed to keep. I adjusted it out of instinct, though no position eased the pressure it placed on my pulse. When I stepped into the corridor beyond my cell, the monastery was steeped in its usual austere quiet, a silence sharpened by discipline rather than doubt. Servitors glided along their prescribed paths, incense drifting from their censers in thin, wavering spirals, while brothers crossed from chapel to training hall with purposeful steps, each movement laden with the certainty I had once felt in my bones. Their oaths remained unbroken. Their resolve ran uncracked. I envied them, and the shame of that envy settled hot and heavy beneath my armor. My own footsteps rang against the stone as I walked, each echo a reminder of the hollow sound my silence had made the night before. I kept my gaze forward, unwilling to meet the eyes of those who might sense the fracture growing inside me, one that had begun not with battle, nor with grief, but with the slow erosion of conviction, carved away grain by grain like a cliff gradually consumed by the tide. As I passed beneath a vault carved with verses of duty and sacrifice, my thoughts returned to the vows I had sworn at the dawn of my service. I remembered the heat of the brand pressed against my skin, the sting of sanctified pain meant to bind me in faith, and the solemn promise I made to carry the Emperor's word into the darkest corners of existence. For years I upheld that vow with unwavering devotion, guiding brothers through horror with litanies recited until my throat burned raw, my voice steady even when my heart faltered. I had been a bastion, a shepherd, a living sermon carved from resolve. And yet somewhere along the unending march of war, amid the screams of the dying and the prayers that dissolved unanswered in the void, something inside me had crumpled quietly, leaving only the shell of a chaplain who still knew the words but could no longer summon the force to believe them. I reached the main hall, its towering statues of saints and heroes staring down with the stern serenity of those whose faith had never wavered. Their stone eyes followed me as though measuring the weight of my steps, assessing whether I still belonged among the ranks of the righteous. A haze of incense clung to the air, thick and sweet, like the remnants of a dream I could no longer recall clearly. I raised my hand to my gorget, tracing the engraved scripture along its edge. The familiar phrase, "Faith is the armor of the soul," felt foreign beneath my fingertips. The words remained true, but the soul they referenced felt battered, threadbare. Armor requires structural integrity. I was no longer certain mine remained intact. Brother Arthon approached me, his stride firm, his presence commanding as always. His voice was quiet but steady as he inquired whether I would lead the midday devotional. I searched myself hastily for the familiar spark, the instinctive readiness that had once ignited at the mere mention of prayer, and found only a hollow echo, like tapping a chalice and discovering it empty. I offered him a nod, though delayed, and he accepted it without question, trusting my word with the implicit confidence of those who have never seen their chaplain falter. That trust struck me with a deeper force than any battlefield wound. It was a debt I feared I no longer had the strength to repay. I made my way to the side chamber where I kept my tools of office, the crozius, the scrolls of absolution, the chained relic containing a saint's cracked fragment of bone. As I lifted the crozius from its resting place, the weapon felt heavier than ever before, not due to its ornate construction, but because of the weight of every oath it symbolized. The skull atop it stared back at me, its hollow socket seeming to ask why my resolve had dimmed. I could not answer. I closed my eyes, forced my fingers to tighten around the haft, and attempted to summon the familiar swell of purpose. Nothing rose. Only a faint ache beneath my ribs, a quiet suggestion that perhaps conviction cannot be willed into existence once it has begun to crumble. When the bell tolled for devotion, the sound echoed through the monastery like a pulse, steady and undeniable. I walked toward the chapel with measured steps, the censer's smoke folding around me as though trying to mask the scent of doubt clinging to my spirit. I entered the chamber to find my brothers waiting, their eyes expectant, trusting, unaware of the storm muttering within me. The collar at my throat tightened once more, or perhaps it was simply my awareness of it growing sharper, as though it sought to remind me that a chaplain with a fractured voice is a contradiction that cannot endure. I opened my mouth to speak the first line of the litany. The words trembled on my tongue, fragile as ash. My breath caught. My silence returned. In that breathless moment, with the entire company waiting for my voice, I understood with painful clarity. The promises I had once forged in fire had cooled into brittle fragments, and the collar I wore so proudly had become a reminder not of duty, but of every vow I feared I could no longer uphold. And yet, even as shame washed over me, a strange gentleness surfaced in its wake, an acknowledgement that brokenness, too, seeks a form of absolution. The censer swung gently in my hand as I lowered my gaze, and the smoke parted just enough to reveal what I had refused to see until now: the beginning of an unraveling that would not be halted by discipline or pride. It was nearly midnight when I returned to the chapel, the corridors dim and hushed in the way only a fortress monastery can be during its rare hours of rest. Every lumen strip lowered to a soft, amber glow that cast the statues in long, skeletal shadows. I came not out of duty, but out of desperation, hoping that solitude might coax my voice back from whatever abyss had swallowed it. The weight of my failed devotion still clung to me, settling into my joints like cold sediment. And though no brother had approached me with questions, their silence pressed upon me with a heaviness more cutting than accusation. The chapel doors groaned faintly as I pushed them open, and the familiar scent of incense and old prayer scrolls washed over me like the memory of a childhood lullaby, a comfort I no longer felt entitled to claim. I expected the space to be empty, but the faint glow of candles revealed the choir, gathered around the central dais, their heads bowed and their voices murmuring in low, disciplined harmony. For a moment I stood frozen in the threshold, uncertain whether I should intrude upon a ritual I had once led but no longer felt part of. They did not see me at first. Their voices rose and fell like waves across stone, each chant perfectly aligned, every syllable a testament to their unwavering faith. I watched them, feeling something like envy coil through my chest, envy for the certainty in their posture, the steadiness in their breath, the cohesion of their devotion. They were untouched by whatever fracture had hollowed me. They belonged. I did not. I waited for the moment when one of them might look up and acknowledge my presence, expecting habit or respect to draw their attention. But none did. Their litany continued, flowing around me as though I were not there at all. I stepped forward, intending to join them, to kneel beside them, to prove to myself that the fracture could be mended by proximity to their devotion. The collar at my throat felt heavier with every step, as though resisting my approach. When my knee touched the stone, the cold shocked through my armor, grounding me in a way that felt both sobering and painful. I opened my mouth, willing the familiar lines of the evening hymn to rise, to slip past the wall that had grown inside me, to let me rejoin the living current of prayer that had sustained our chapter through centuries of war. But nothing came. Only the shape of the words formed on my tongue, soundless and empty. My breath fell flat, unable to gain the rhythm necessary to carry the hymn forward. One of the brothers, Tavian, a veteran whose voice could steady an entire battalion, glanced in my direction. For a fleeting moment, I thought he recognized the desperation in my posture, but instead of offering the subtle nod of acknowledgement he had given me for decades, he let his gaze pass over me like a man looking through fog, not out of cruelty, not out of judgment, but out of the quiet, devastating certainty that I no longer stood among them. His eyes slipped away, returning to the scripture before him, and the choir's chant continued unabated. Their voices rose in solemn unity, weaving into one another with a grace I could not access, forming a tapestry from which I felt painfully, irrevocably unthreaded. A tremor ran through my hands, not the trembling of fear, but the trembling of someone who realizes he has been standing at the edge of a precipice far longer than he knew. I bowed my head, pressing my palms against my knees in a futile attempt to steady myself. The choir shifted seamlessly into another verse, one celebrating the endurance of the righteous, and the words, so familiar I could recite them even in the depths of exhaustion, turned sharp inside me, cutting through what little confidence remained. I mouthed them silently, pretending for a moment that my echo could blend with theirs, but the illusion shattered instantly. Their harmony did not falter or bend to include me. It flowed past like a river around a stone, carrying on without the slightest recognition of my presence. Only then did I understand. They were praying not with me, but without me. And in some subtle, painful way, perhaps even against the burden of my weakness, for the strength of the chapter, for the purity of the faith, for the collective soul that could not afford a fracture like mine. Their devotion was not cruel, it was simply whole. In comparison, I had become an absence, a void, a place where sound should exist but no longer could. A cold settled beneath my armor, deeper than any physical chill. I rose slowly, my joints protesting, my breath thin and ragged. No one looked up. No one paused. Their litany continued in unbroken unity as I stepped backward, retreating toward the chapel doors with the quiet, unsteady gait of a ghost realizing it has left the realm of the living. When I reached the threshold, I glanced back once more, not in hope, but in mourning. The candlelight flickered across their bowed helmets, casting halos of warm gold around each warrior as though the emperor himself stood with them. And perhaps he did. But he did not stand with me, not anymore. The doors closed behind me with a soft, decisive thud. In that moment, the fracture inside me widened into something undeniable, a chasm that no prayer could bridge. I whispered the opening line of the hymn one last time into the empty hallway, hoping the words might cling to the stones even if they refused to cling to my voice. But my whisper dissolved before reaching the air, leaving me alone with the understanding that I had crossed an invisible threshold, the point at which a chaplain ceases to lead and becomes the one who needs leading, though there is no path laid out for those who falter in the emperor's name. In the silence that followed, I realized the night had not merely stolen the choir's prayers from me. It had shown me a truth I had long tried to avoid. I was no longer a part of their harmony. I had become the quiet space between their notes, the gap no one acknowledges but everyone must sing around. And in that space, alone with my broken faith, I felt the first true ache of abandonment settle into my bones, not inflicted by my brothers, but by myself. I had rehearsed confessions in the dark for months, short liturgies muttered like talismans against the slow unmaking of my voice, phrases arranged and rearranged until they fit the hollow I felt in my chest. But when the moment arrived, it did so not as a neat line of contrition, but as a swelling that refused every neat shape I offered it, a truth too large for the small, proper syllables the chapel had taught me to breathe. I found myself one dawn kneeling in a narrow side chapel beneath a statue whose face had been worn soft by centuries of hands. The stone's smooth, cheekless saint gazing down without judgment, and I cradled the confession in my hands like an uncut stone, turning it every which way to find an edge that would let it pass through my lips. And yet the confession resisted, as if it knew some words would break me more thoroughly than any blade. The air was blue with candle light and the lingering smoke of last night's censer, and the hush of the monastery had a weight to it that felt almost sentient, as if even the stones listened for transgressions they had no authority to forgive. I tried once to begin, the practiced cadence rising from the throat by reflex, but it faltered and thinned into a whisper that my own ears, trained to hear truth in volume, could hardly trust. What would I confess when what I had become was not a neat sin, but an accumulation of small, reneged promises, the gradual theft of mercy from those I loved because I had told myself mercy would be weakness in the coming struggle? How do you shape a litany around the hours you stood at bedsides and counted the breaths of men you could not save, deciding which cries to answer and which to consign as inevitable losses so the rest might continue? The confessions I had prepared were technical, professional. Omissions logged, counsel withheld, a failure to visit a dying man in the last watch because duty demanded I be elsewhere. Such things a chaplain's ledger can list without shame. Yet the thing that took up space behind my breastbone demanded a different accounting, one that would smudge the edges of doctrine and implicate the tender places I had hidden from myself. I had kept a catalog of words not said, names left unspoken, laughter I had not permitted myself to share lest compassion soften my command. Now that catalog overflowed, and each unseen name pressed like a small coin against the tongue of my conscience, refusing to be swallowed down by routine or prayer. I pressed my forehead to the cool marble and tried to force the confession out as if squeezing water from a stone. But the sound tangled in the throat and returned to me more bruised than before. Perhaps the most damning truth I carried was this: I had loved them, not in the loud, theatrical fashion the canon demands, but with a private, faltering devotion that often translated into small mercies. A second ration tucked away, a whispered blessing in the dark for a soldier whose mother would never claim his body, a hand held for a moment on a forehead too cold for tears, acts that scripture would call charity, but in the ledgered logic of war they read as softness, distractions, liabilities. I could no longer reconcile those private mercies with the hard architecture of my office, and the confession, when it finally unfurled in me, swelled into a single unbearable sentence that had no room in any liturgy. I failed to make the sacrifice I promised because I was afraid my sacrifice would leave me less able to love. Saying it aloud would have been straightforward cruelty, to myself and perhaps to others. So instead it lodged in my mouth and grew heavy, until each attempt to shape it forced me to choke on the weight. The chapel around me felt both too small and infinite, as if the very vaults above had widened to swallow the breadth of my shame, and the candles threw shadows that became mockeries of courage I did not possess. I thought of those I had comforted, and of those I had turned away, and the faces crowded my mind like a legion of unpaid debts. There was Brother Leto, who had gripped my sleeve with cold, urgent hands the night before a campaign, and begged me to hear the confession he had been denied by bureaucracy. I had told him to return after the battle, promising absolution that the kinks of time and duty would not allow me to keep. He had died in the field, and the memory of his outstretched palm haunted me now with a cruelty sharper than any indictment from a tribunal. There was Sister Halla, her jaw set like tempered iron, who had smuggled bandages to the wounded of a rival regiment when official channels failed. I had known and said nothing, fearing reprisal for fraternization, and the silence between us had become a chasm. All these small omissions stitched together into the rot that ate my trust in myself, and I could not find a formula to box such woundings neatly into canonical confession forms. I tried different beginnings, the ritual of contrition, the formulaic request for absolution, the humble pleading with the emperor's mercy. But each recitation peeled back the tender membrane of my inward truth, only to expose the rawness beneath, leaving me exposed to my own gaze. In that exposure, I felt something else stirring, less tractable than shame. A grief so particular it seemed nearly private, not the public lamentation of a chapter for lost brothers, but a private bereavement for the man I had been before his voice was eroded by the calculations of survival. The confession that would not fit my mouth was not bad theology. It was soft, human, an ache of love misapplied and abandoned. And the hardest thing was not the owning of my failures, but the realization that there were no scripts to make them neat. I remained kneeling until the lamps guttered low, until the chapel's breath slowed to the frequency of one who waits without hope. And in that patient waiting, a small, quiet thought crept forward, not shaped into prayer but into a petition. Perhaps confession is not always a clerical formality, but sometimes an offering to oneself, a naming of the ways one has been less than kind so that otherness, if such a mercy can be found, might mend what my craft could not. I rose from my knees with the confession still lodged like a stone in my throat, and the gorget around my neck seemed suddenly less like armor and more like an instrument of chastening. I moved through the empty nave with the slow deliberation of a penitent, and outside, where the cold air of the courtyard met me, my breath came ragged but true, a private litany for the failures I could not yet grant aloud. I returned to the great chapel not out of duty, nor even out of habit, but because I needed to stand once more among the remnants of a life that seemed to be slipping through my fingers like incense smoke. And as I crossed the threshold, the vast chamber greeted me not with the majesty it once held, but with a muted stillness, a hush that felt less like reverence and more like dust settling over an abandoned book. The candles guttered in long rows, their flames shrinking low as if exhausted by their own devotion, and every shadow cast by their trembling light seemed longer, heavier, shaped by memories I had not consciously summoned, but which had returned unbidden to gather in the silent corners of my mind. This place had been the sanctuary in which I instructed initiates, offered absolution, recited victory chants, and delivered rites for the dead. Yet now it felt as though the chapel itself kept a ledger of my failures, each stone retaining the faint imprint of footsteps I had once guided with certainty. I walked down the central aisle slowly, listening for echoes that did not come, noticing the absence of the familiar scrape of armored boots or the chorus of whispered devotion. It occurred to me then how many small things had vanished over time without my noticing. A young brother's eager questions, the warm timbre of a comrade's laugh, the tremor in the air when 100 voices rose in perfect unison to praise the emperor's mercy. These were the things I should have cherished, and yet now they surfaced only as ache, preserved in memory like dried flowers brittle with age. I paused at a pew where Brother Neron used to sit, his posture always immaculate, his eyes bright with devotion, and found myself tracing the worn edge of the wood where his gauntlets had rested countless times. He had died 3 campaigns ago, cut down before he could complete the vows he had spent his life longing to fulfill, and I had given him the last rites with a voice still strong then, still full of conviction, still certain that my words could ferry his soul safely into the Emperor's light. The memory tightened around my heart like a clasp. How easily I had spoken then, how wholly I had believed in the sanctity of the liturgy I carried. Now, when I tried to recall the rite I had whispered to him, the lines came to me frayed and incomplete, as though the words themselves were disintegrating under the weight of my doubt. I moved farther down the pews, discovering more absences, places where familiar figures once knelt, brothers whose presence had been so constant I had assumed it eternal. Brother Marius, who hummed hymns under his breath when he sharpened his blade. Initiate Callan, whose restless feet tapped out unconscious prayers in the cadence of marching drills. Sister Vexa, whose quiet compassion had steadied countless soldiers in their darkest moments. Their ghosts lingered in the wood, in the scratches left by armor, in the faint scent of oils still clinging to the benches. But the chapel itself had swallowed their warmth, leaving only the hollow outline of where they had been. The further I walked, the more I realized how much of myself I had left scattered across this chamber. The fragments of sermons, the echoes of my own younger voice raised not in warning or lament, but in genuine joy, something I scarcely recognized anymore. At the dais, where the great lectern stood beneath a towering icon of the Emperor, I stopped and rested my hand against the carved skull of the lectern's handle. Once, standing here, I had felt as though the Emperor's gaze steadied my breath. Now it felt as though the icon gazed past me entirely, unable to find the man it once entrusted with sacred duty. The candles nearest the altar flickered weakly, their flames bending toward me and then away again, uncertain how to regard the presence of a chaplain who no longer knew how to speak the faith he was sworn to uphold. My throat tightened as I looked upon the relic case behind the altar, where personal items from fallen brothers were enshrined. A torn purity seal, a cracked aquila pendant, the hilt of a sword whose blade had been lost to time. These were the small vanished things that no litany could restore, tokens of lives I had tried to honor, though even now I wondered whether I had truly done them justice. I had prayed over each one, had recited the appropriate rites, had spoken the necessary words, but perhaps what they needed was not ritual, but presence, something I had offered imperfectly at best. My silence now felt like a betrayal not only of the Imperium, but of them. I reached out and placed my fingertips against the cool glass of the relic case, imagining for one fragile moment that the warmth of my touch might be enough to stir the memories held within, to coax some faint whisper of the voices I had lost. But the glass remained unyielding, and the relics within remained still, preserving only the emptiness left behind. As I stood there, surrounded by all that had slipped away quietly while I had been too consumed by duty to notice, a slow understanding settled upon me. I had not merely forgotten how to pray, I had forgotten how to mourn. And in failing to mourn, I had let the chapel itself become a mausoleum for emotions I had buried instead of naming. The silence was no longer accusing, it was reflective, inviting me to acknowledge the weight I had carried alone for far too long. Even the collar at my throat seemed to loosen slightly, as if recognizing that its pressure had become unbearable. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the familiar scent of incense wash over me, no longer a symbol of ritual but a quiet reminder of the countless souls who had once breathed this same air with trust in my voice. A tremor passed through me, not of fear, but of sorrow finally waking. I exhaled, and in that breath I felt the smallest fracture shift, not widening, not healing, but becoming visible at last. The chapel remained silent, but it no longer felt empty. It felt honest, and I knew, standing there amid the vanished things of my past, that the journey ahead would not restore my voice. But perhaps in learning to name what had been lost, I might yet find the part of myself that had disappeared with them. There is a bell in our monastery that seldom rings. It hangs in the western cloister, suspended from an iron frame polished smooth by centuries of weather and devotion, its surface etched with litanies so old the script has softened into near illegibility. It is not the bell that calls to battle, nor the one that summons the chapter to prayer. It is the bell reserved for remembrance, an ancient instrument whose toll marks the passing of one who has died without kin to mourn them. I had stood beneath it countless times, the Crozius at my side, offering the rites for nameless dead whose bodies we consigned to the sacred flame. I had spoken the final blessings with a strength meant to reassure those who remained. But the morning after I walked through the chapel of vanished things, I heard the bell's voice differently, not as a ritual call, but as a lamentation shaped for me alone. Its deep resonance rolled through the stone corridors with an ache that burrowed into my marrow, and I knew with a strange, unmistakable certainty that this toll was not for the fallen of the chapter. It was a sound meant to echo the fractures in my own spirit, a vibration tuned to the hollow I carried beneath my armor. I found myself drawn toward it, my steps slow, as though the air had thickened around me into a kind of underwater weight. The cloister was empty when I arrived, the dawn light filtering through narrow arches and muted gold beams that fractured across the flagstones. The bell swayed gently, though no hand had touched it, as if stirred by some unseen presence. I approached with hesitation, my gauntlets trembling slightly as I reached toward the rope. I did not yet intend to ring it. I only wished to steady it, to quiet the swaying that made my pulse stutter in time with its movement. And yet, when my fingers grazed the rope's frayed fibers, the bell ceased its gentle sway and grew utterly still, as though it, too, recognized me as the one whose sorrow had summoned it. I stepped closer, feeling my breath deepen with the weight of the moment. The bell towered above me, its etched prayers catching the dawn light in brief glimmers. I traced a fingertip along one of the inscriptions, feeling the grooves worn shallow by age. In its cold metal, I sensed 1,000 unspoken regrets, layered one atop another by the chaplains who had served before me, men who had faltered, broken, or lost their voices in the crucible of duty, their silent grief suspended in the air like dust motes illuminated by morning sun. It struck me then that I was not alone in my unraveling. The bell had witnessed every weary chaplain who had knelt beneath it, who had bowed their head in shame or sorrow, who had grieved not for the dead, but for the parts of themselves they had sacrificed to keep others alive. The truth of that kinship stung. I rested both hands on the rope and felt the fibers bite gently into my palms. A single pull would send the bell's voice crashing through the monastery, but I hesitated, knowing the implications. The toll of this bell was a finality given form, a proclamation of loss, a confession made public without requiring words. To pull that rope would be to admit to myself and to all who heard it that something in me had died. The certitude of my faith, the steadiness of my voice, the clarity of my calling. It would mean acknowledging the death of a chaplain who still walked, armored and breathing, yet hollowed in ways no rite could mend. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness behind them, faces appeared. Those I had failed to absolve, those whose last confessions I never heard, those whose eyes had looked to me for assurance I could no longer provide. Their silhouettes drifted like ash, forming and dissolving in the space where my prayers once lived. I felt the weight of every unspoken absolution pressing against the collar of my gorget, constricting my throat. My breath hitched, and a tremor ran not just through my hands but through my entire frame, a quaking born of years of brittle composure beginning to fracture. The bell remained silent, but its presence felt expectant, patient. I released the rope and let my hands fall to my sides. I would not ring the bell, not yet. To do so now would be to surrender entirely, to declare myself unfit before I had finished the long inward pilgrimage my silence demanded. But in refusing, I felt no triumph, only a deeper awareness of the distance between who I had been and who I had become. I sank to one knee beneath the bell's shadow, lowering my head as though in supplication, though no rite accompanied the gesture. The air smelled faintly of old metal and damp stone, and in that sensory silence, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge the regret that had been gathering behind every breath. Not regret for my failure as a chaplain, but regret for how long I had pretended not to feel the slow erosion of my own devotion. A soft breeze drifted through the cloister, stirring the edge of my robe and carrying with it the faintest murmur of distant chanting. My brothers were beginning the morning rites without me, for the second day in a row. Their voices rose in disciplined harmony, and though I once would have joined them instinctively, I now remained kneeling beneath the silent bell, feeling the distance widen with every note. I listened until their chant became a faint hum swallowed by the walls, then lifted my head to look once more at the bell. Its stillness seemed almost compassionate, as though offering me one more day, one more chance to reclaim what I feared was slipping beyond reach. I stood slowly, my knees protesting the weight of my armor, and placed one hand against the cool metal of the bell. For a moment, I imagined it vibrating beneath my palm, resonating with the frequency of all my unspoken confessions. Whether it truly moved or I only imagined it, I could not tell. But I whispered into that silence, no psalm, no litany, nothing formal or sacred, only a single sentence shaped from the rawness of my regret. The bell did not ring, but it heard me. I found the icon by accident, or perhaps it found me, tucked in a narrow alcove off the eastern transept where the stone had been carved centuries ago, and the faces of saints had softened with the fingers of pilgrims. The carving was small, half swallowed by shadow and moss, a weathered visage with one eye chipped away by time, and when I sank to my knees before it, the act felt less like ritual and more like surrender, as if the chapel itself had arranged a private audience for the confession my mouth would not bear. The air there was cooler, the incense thinner, and the muffled recitation of the chapter sounded like waves far beyond the reach of that little alcove, so that my solitude felt both chosen and inevitable. I pressed my forehead to the worn stone where the saint's brow bowed, behaving in the oldest way men behave when words fail them, closer to an animal's instinct than to the learned posture of a priest. And in that contact, I felt a tiny echo, a hollow answered by history, as if the saint through whose carved eyes I begged could remember the weight of mortal grief and offer no doctrine but presence. The icon offered no sign, no miracle, no thunderous reply, only the cool, unjudging face of stone and the faint grit that fell into my palm like sand. And yet that silence was not empty. It was full of the lives that had leaned here before me, full of whispered names, full of hands that had smoothed its cheek in the hope of return. And I realized with a sudden vertigo that the stone kept more prayers than any ledger could hold, and that its patience exceeded my capacity for performance. I attempted the liturgy I had rehearsed 1,000 times, the phrases that had once rolled out of me like the measured tread of marching feet. But the words came out skeletal, the cadences hollow and unfamiliar in my own ears. So I stopped trying to pray as I had been taught, and instead offered the smaller things that had lodged under my ribs for years, the names of soldiers I had failed to visit, the half-promises that had tied my hands while men bled, the tiny mercies I had surrendered to bureaucracy. And I spoke them not as formal confession, but as a string of private litany, each name a stone I laid at the saint's feet in the hope that the small accumulation of honesty might be heavier than the armor I wore. The alcove did not answer with thunder or lightning or the visionary fire the old tales promised. It answered with something quieter, a kind of listening that settled on me like a hand steadying a sick child. And in that listening, my shame felt less like a tribunal and more like a wound that had finally been seen. There was no absolution offered in any law book, no clause or rubric that could render such messy failures neat. The icon did not offer neatness. It offered the mirroring of my sorrow back to me without embellishment, and that was its mercy. I had always believed mercy would come as an edict, a proclamation, a tidy salvation with a fanfare and a seal. But the stone taught me that mercy could also arrive, wearing no name, in the form of another thing that simply bore witness. I remained there long after my knees ached, and the candles nearby had burned to stubs. Outside the alcove, the chapter's chants rose and fell in their precise measures, apparatus of communal faith continuing without curiosity for my private collapse. Yet inside the small hearing of the saint my voice grew no louder and no stronger. Instead it thinned into a string of memories and small contritions that had once been too shameful to reveal aloud. I did not seek certainty. I sought an audience. The carved face did not judge. It kept my names. It held them in the same basket where it had kept centuries of supplications. And I felt, with a humility that stung, the beginning of a reconciled understanding, that perhaps faith is not a trumpet of commands but a certain endurance of attention to the small, everyday failures we never pretend to fix in public. When I left the alcove, my shoulders were not lighter in the way triumph relieves a man, but in the manner of someone who has taken on an honest burden and thus knows how to carry it. The gorget at my throat felt no less heavy, but the pressure in my chest that had made my voice a stranger eased enough to allow a crooked whisper on the air that was neither liturgy nor personal boast, just a quiet tallying, a quiet promise to try to be present where my presence mattered most. The rest of the day I moved through the monastery in a dim bubble of altered purpose, Where before I had been driven by performance, by the need to be seen and relied upon, I found myself practicing a smaller ministry, attending to the minor tasks others overlooked, pausing at the sick bay longer than protocol required, lingering by the table where the novices ate to hear the half-formed questions they did not yet dare to ask out loud. I learned to listen to silences the way I had once listened to chant cadences, discerning the shape of absence in a breath, and I gave time as if it were coin. Never before had I so clearly understood that a chaplain's true work is not always to shout solace into the void, but to remain where the void might otherwise expand unobserved. Some of my brothers noticed these small shifts and reacted as men do when the furniture of long-standing certainties rearranges. A few frowned with the bureaucratic irritation of those whose rhythms the change disrupted. Some kept their distance because they feared contagion of doubt, and a rare handful drew near, offering the awkward courtesies of comrades learning new languages of care. No proclamations were made, no reports filed. The change was slow and subtle and unspectacular, like moss colonizing stone, and I tended it in secret, afraid that scrutiny might force it back into brittle shapes. Night came, and with it a different hearing. The chapel emptied, the great doors sealed, and the hush returned like a warm blanket. I walked once more to the alcove, placed my palm where the saint's eye had been worn away, and this time the carved face felt less like a judge and more like the patient keeper of a ledger no bureaucracy could touch. I whispered the names I had carried that day, not asking for absolution, but simply making an account of my love and my failure. And when I left the stone, there was a strange steadiness in my step, a knowledge that even if my voice could not yet carry the force of public faith, it could still sustain the quieter work of holding names, of keeping watch over the living and the dead in the spirit of a chaplain who had finally learned how to be small and necessary, in the way the emperor alone had never taught me. The small steadiness I had found in the alcove proved to be a fragile thing, like a newly laid patch of moss on stone. It held under my palm for a few quiet days, and then, as if the world corrected for my brief lapse in hardness, the old pressures crept back with a patience that felt almost punitive, settling at the base of my throat where the gorget pressed, and in the hollows beneath my ribs where names I could not save nested like stubborn seeds. I woke one morning to the clang of water in the gutters and a memory that arrived not as image, but as sound. The distant cough of a man I had refused to visit because the patrol manifest required my presence elsewhere, and the sound unlocked the dam I had patched with intention, and the weight of that refusal poured through me all at once until I felt as if the chapel itself leaned inward to pity me or to judge me. I could not tell which. For a day or two I managed small things. I lingered at the infirmary. I spoke a half-formed blessing while my hands tied bandages with rituals that felt automatic and therefore safe. And I kept the ledger of the dead in order as if tidy centuries-old scrolls could pretend my failures into irrelevance. But the quiet ministrations that had soothed me began to feel like camouflage, a way of appearing whole, while the interior architecture of my conviction rotted in hidden places. Clerks brought papers requiring signatures, commanders asked for counsel on funerary rites, and novices sought direction on how to address grief in men who would not, by training, permit themselves to be soft, and each task demanded an assurance I no longer possessed. So I answered with the forms I had always used, and felt the hollow echo of them ricochet against my sternum like a boot against a tombstone. The choir still sang without me in the appointed hours, their harmonies untroubled by my faltering, and sometimes their voices slipped through the chapel stone and into my cell like blades of light that exposed the dust on my soul. I tried to step back into the role I had known, to read the liturgies with the measured cadence of a man who has faith to spare. But the words came out crisp and correct, yet lacking the warmth that once braided authority into consolation. And those who listened returned to their tasks with the same reliance as before, none the wiser that my inner weather had turned stormy. There were moments when small things, little human things, pierced the pretense and broke the numbness into something raw. A novice left a scraped bread crust where she thought I might be hungry, and it lodged in my throat not as gratitude, but as shame for the systems that forced charity into secrecy. An old veteran I had once absolved for a cowardice he confessed in private bumped my robe with his elbow in passing and murmured thanks, as if the absolution had healed him. And I believed him because he believed, though the truth sat heavy between us both. I had offered the words then to steady both the living and myself, and perhaps the ease his thanks gave him was the only proof I would ever have of my usefulness. Yet for every such small grace the ledger beneath my ribs accrued new entries, faces I had forgotten to visit, last words I had not heard, promises I had made in the heat of urgency and let cool into neglect. Each entry weighed as much as any closed casket. I dreamt less in sleep than in scraps, voices caught in passageways, a child's knotted mitten left under a bench, a woman's muffled sob that I had rationalized away because an assault called for immediate triage, and the rest would have to wait. The rest never waited. It accumulated into the slow, assertive pressure that now returned to reclaim me. In the quiet before dawn, I found myself standing beneath the bell once more, the iron cool beneath my palm, and for a fleeting moment I considered pulling the rope to let the toll proclaim the admission I would not otherwise make aloud. But prudence, fear, drove my fingers away, and I realized the weight that had returned was not only regret, but also the practical calculus of duty. Confessing loudly would disrupt the chapter's order in ways I could not afford. So I filed my confession into hidden margins again, writing names in a private volume with a pen that smeared when my hand shook. And I taught myself to breathe around the shame, the way one might breathe around a wound that must be left to close on its own. This private ledger became a kind of liturgy for me, a place where I could at least acknowledge my omissions in ink when my mouth would not form the syllables. I read the list at night and tried to imagine how I might make amends, not with grand gestures, but with small, deliberate acts that would not draw the chapter's scrutiny. An extra ration left anonymously, a whispered benediction over a sleeping form, a visit to a grave between duties so I might look a name in the face and commit its history to memory. These acts steadied me in part, though never wholly. The weight returned in the spaces between them like rain finding its way under stone. Where once I took pride in being unshakable, I now found myself learning a new craft, the art of returning repeatedly to apologies that cannot be made grand, of performing humility until the muscles relearned how to bow without breaking. The strain showed physically. My shoulders bowed, my steps slowed. My throat felt raw from words unspoken, and the frailty was both a humiliation and a sharp reminder that flesh has limits doctrine cannot erase. Even my brothers perceived the change. Brother Arthon, who had once relied on my certainty, began to watch me with a careful apprehension, as if measuring my availability for counsel against an unknown decline. And when he caught me in the infirmary cradling a man no one else had time for, he did not scold, but only offered a small nod that held confusion, sympathy, and the burden of expectation all at once. That nod cut me more deeply than any reprimand would have, because it meant he expected me to return to the old steadiness I could not simply manufacture. The weight returned like a tide, relentless in its patience, flushing out the small consolations I had built. There were nights I wept in secret, tears not of theatrical repentance, but of exhaustion, sobbing for the lives I could not fold into order, for the children who would never know the men they had lost, for my own unpredictable failure to be the man I had promised to be. In those moments, the silence of the chapel gnawed at me, not as accusation, but as a space I felt obligated to refill with something honest. And so I continued to move through the days, performing rites, listening to whispers, answering calls, each action a negotiation between the weight pressing from within and the expectations pressing from without. And though for a time the small steadiness had seemed like a possible reformation, the return of the burden taught me a harsher lesson. Repentance and ministry are not neat arcs that culminate in redemption, but ongoing labors, repeated efforts to make amends in a system that never pauses for full repair. And it is perhaps the cruelest thing to ask of a man that he bear such labor alone. I thought the heaviest hours had passed, that the small repairs I performed in secret had been enough to stitch me back into usefulness. But weight is cunning and returns in layered ways. One morning a summons came, an urgent call from a forward watch where a strike had gutted an outpost, and I read the names of the dead aloud as if performing some final accounting. And as the list spilled from my lips, the syllables felt like stones I was trying to carry in a sack with a hole, each name sliding free before I could set it down. My throat tightened in ritual cadence, and the sound that left me was precise yet hollow, and I realized that technique without conviction is only the mimicry of ministry. I traveled to the outpost at dusk, moving through corridors that expect no tenderness, and the scene there was the quiet punctuation of sudden absence. Helmets lined like sleeping heads, banners slumped, a child's slipper by a cracked cradle, and a scorched portrait hanging askew on a warped frame. I moved among the bodies with motions honed by duty: wash, anoint, intone. But each formula peeled away from me like a moth's wing, beautiful, inadequate, until even the ritual felt like stagecraft performed to reassure the living rather than to guide the dead. An old bugler who had survived caught my eye and asked, simply, whether I believed the words I spoke, and his question cut through my composure like a blade. There, amid singed oil and breath that tasted of frost, I understood how faith can become a professional instrument wielded for public comfort rather than a living thing inside a person's chest. I had tended others until tending hollowed me. Ritual had become both armor and prison. I sat with a fallen officer whose hand would not be lifted back to life, and whispered the only honest syllables my tongue could manage. "Sorry, forgive me." The cold answered with silence, and the hollowness inside me, fed by the intimacy of my failure, sank deeper, planting bitter roots that tugged at convictions I once thought immutable. The battalion expected absolution at dawn. Families would seek steadiness, meaning a promise the lost were watched. But I was no longer certain I possessed the muscle for such certainty. That night the chapel felt entirely alien when I stumbled back. The icons gazed like strangers posed to witness a play I could no longer perform. I knelt and tried to form the old prayers, their cadences slipping in my mouth like cold iron. And when I sought the private alcove, the stone's cool comfort failed to soothe the image of the officer's hand falling through mine. I thought of the private ledger beneath my pillow and considered burning it to rid myself of the accumulating weight, but that would have been cowardice. It was my confession in ink, the record of omissions, and destroying it would be another erasure. So I kept it, and its pages grew heavy with promises postponed, absolutions delayed until pretense became avoidance. As dawn seeped gray through the chapel slits, I heard the temple bells and my brothers gather. When they called for the chaplain, my feet refused the pace they once kept with automatic precision. I stood at the threshold and watched them sing, faces upturned and open to the light, and felt a transparent wall rise between me and the chapter, a liminal province where I could see and remember and could not return. That day, a mother pressed a carved toy into my hands and asked for blessing, meaning assurance. I offered words shaped and weary, and she left believing I had given solace, perhaps because belief will bend itself around what it needs. Yet I alone felt the hollowness in my syllables. The small fractures accelerated. Omissions, delayed visits, vows unmet. Friends who once shielded me watched with quiet resignation as I resembled the broken figure I privately recognized. I scribed the ledger until my hand cramped and the ink bled into a blot that looked like a tear. And when I closed it, I placed the book beneath my pillow as if proximity might grant absolution. Sleep did not come. Dreams arrived instead. Fragmented scenes where faces I loved accused me by presence. A sneaker on a step, a laugh cut off mid-syllable, a letter never delivered. I woke with a sound lodged beneath my breastbone, a hollow resonance that felt like pressure against my sternum. And for the first time I questioned whether continuing in my office was service or a self-deception sustained at the public's expense. The idea of stepping away hovered like a shadow, retreat to a distant cloister where failures dissolve into dust. But resignation felt like abandonment to those I served, and to vows I had vowed in better hours. So I stood in the slow tension between staying for duty and leaving for honesty. In that tension, my faith quivered, not as a sudden crack, but as a tremor no prayer could still. And I understood the fracture had reached a point where concealment no longer served either my conscience or the living. The day closed with me unable to sleep and unwilling to speak. And in that double silence, I made a decision that felt less like courage and more like the honest admission of a man who has learned his limits. Tomorrow, I would ask to be relieved of certain public duties and recommit myself to the quieter, humbler work I had tasted in the alcove. Presence, remembering. It was not a resignation from faith, but a reformation of service. a quieter priesthood that acknowledged my voice's limits and favored the needs of the living over the performance of certainty. And the thought sat in my chest like a cool stone waiting to be set. Yet the ledger under my pillow still hummed with accusation, promising that my days would remain a negotiation between duty's demands and the slow work of making amends. I rose before the bells, the air inside my cell still and gentle in the way of moments that do not yet know whether they will carry sorrow or grace. And for the first time in many months, I did not reach immediately for the ledger beneath my pillow. Instead, I sat on the edge of the cot and let the hush settle around me. A hush not of vacancy, but of invitation, as though the chapel waited to learn what shape my next breath would take. My body moved slowly, as if wary of startling the fragile resolve I had finally formed, to step down from the louder rites and return to the smaller, humbler work that my voice, thinned by grief, could still bear. And when I opened my door, the corridor met me not with judgment, but with a cool draft that carried the faint scent of incense and steel, a reminder that even within these walls life persisted at a rhythm larger than my private turmoil. I walked toward the alcove, each step deliberate, tracing a path worn by countless supplicants before me. The stone underfoot felt familiar, textured with centuries of barefoot pilgrims and armored tread. And as I neared the carved visage, I sensed a gentle loosening beneath my ribs, a readiness to place the final weight where it belonged. Kneeling, I touched my forehead to the saint's worn brow, and though I felt no tremor of revelation, the stone received me with the same patient indifference it offered all who came, an acceptance that did not insist I be whole before I arrived. I whispered the truth I had avoided naming, that I could not continue shaping my voice into a tool for comfort when that comfort had grown brittle, that my ministry had to shrink to fit the size of my strength. And as I spoke, the alcove did not recoil. It simply held the confession, matching my frailty with its own weathered endurance. The silence did not accuse me. It steadied me. I realized then that faith had never demanded perfection from me. I had demanded it of myself, and in doing so had mistaken exhaustion for failure. Service could be quiet. Service could be small. Service could be nothing more than sitting with the grieving until their breath steadied, remembering names others forgot, tending to wounds that did not make it into reports. When I rose, the decision felt finished, not triumphant but settled deep as a stone placed carefully back into a wall. I sought out the reclusiarch, finding him in the dim of the armory chapel, where he polished his crozius with the devotion of a craftsman restoring a relic. I told him that my voice was no longer suited for the grand rites, that I needed to serve in humbler ways until strength returned, and his reply came not in rebuke, but with a gentle nod, as if he had known this was coming before I did. He placed a hand on my pauldron with a weight that did not press but affirmed, and in that gesture I felt a subtle release, the loosening of chains I had bound upon myself. There was no ceremony for the shift in duty, no proclamation, no rumor. Life in the chapter moved on as it always had, and I resumed my days in smaller chambers, visiting the wounded without the expectation of performance, sitting with recruits who feared the silence more than the battlefield, lighting candles for the dead not as theater but in tender memory. The ledger beneath my pillow grew no lighter, but its weight no longer crushed, Instead, it became a book of names I carried with reverence rather than shame, each entry a reminder of why I chose this quieter path. I understood now that ministry was not the loud proclamation of unshakable faith, but the steady companionship of souls who tremble. Nights grew easier, dreams softened. The chapel's hush no longer echoed like accusation, but like shared breathing. And on the final night of that long season, I returned once more to the alcove, placing my hand on the saint's worn cheek. I whispered that I would not stop trying, that remembrance itself could be a form of prayer, and the stone, patient as ever, received the words without question. When I stepped away, the corridor lights flickered gently, as though the monastery exhaled around me. I walked back to my cell with unhurried steps, feeling neither triumphant nor defeated, only present, finally present in the life I still had to give. I lay down, the ledger resting beside me rather than hidden, and closed my eyes as the bells began their soft call for evening prayer. Their distant hum folded around me like a cloak, and in that sound I felt a quiet completion, a settling of dust after years of inward storms. Whatever came next, I would meet it not as the unbreakable icon I once tried to be, but as a man who had learned the sacredness of small endurance, of imperfect service, of choosing to remain. And as sleep drew near, gentle at last, a final whisper crossed my thoughts, less prayer than memory, less command than release, carried on the slow breath of the dark. I am still here.